Okay. Um, so we are going to cover a period called Modernism, and which is located a little before the First World War, which was started in 1914 and continues to post World War II. And as we have studied in our classes earlier, we have spoken and discussed about the aftermath of the war, the effects of the war. One of the key words in relation to the aftermath of the war would be post-war reconstruction. That means so there's so much death, decay, devastation, buildings are damaged, lives are lost, families are rendered fatherless, women are rendered widows, the economy of the country is straggling, and all these things are to be addressed through the reconstruction. But much before the war broke out, probably 4 years before the war broke out, uh, Virginia Woolf stated, on or about December 1910, human character changed. Relations between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children, and when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. So it is foregone conclusion that a nation's culture is seen in the family, right? The family is the basic unit of society. So the relationships in the family are very indicative of the relationships in society, how the people behave, the values they hold, right? So she says something changed, and she's fixing it at a particular period also, of the very month. She says about December 1910. What could have happened in and around 1910? So 1910 was the year where Halley's comet was discovered. The Russian writer Tolstoy died. In the Russian ballet, came to Paris. So culture was traveling. Freud gained, his writings gained ground, and Cubism as an art form was blossoming in France. Uh, so all these things, then uh, the king died, King Edward the Seventh, and in two elections, right? There was you saw that there was a decline in political consensus. The political system was not stable. So you know that in people's ways of thinking, there's people are right wing and left wing. Left wing would be the Marxist type, and right wing are very fundamentalist. They're probably very strong on religion or very strong on cultural identity, right? So, um, so there was more leaning towards the left, right? And this again, you can see is the influence of Russia coming in, and socialism, Marxism, labor unrest. So people, because probably people were fighting for higher wages, so there was that kind of unrest. And Ireland, from our learning of social history of England, we know Ireland was ruled by England. Ireland was not culturally a part of England, but England forced itself on Ireland, right? So, um, and most of Ireland is Catholic. A bit of Northern Ireland is Protestant. There again, because of British influence. So, and you know much about the poet Yeats, the poem Easter 1916, and about how always Ireland wanted to be independent of England. Uh, so uh, these movements were seen even in the world of arts. So if you look at the history of art, realism precedes symbolism. Realism precedes impressionism, and impressionism, after impressionism, you have the post impressionists, and prior to the realists, you have the symbolists. Uh, and in all um, literature, in all political movements, whether movements in art, politics, or literature, you see that one period reacts to the tenets of the previous age, and they form a set of paradigms, or uh, they create a canon which is opposed. So, a very obvious example would be how Victorian was different from Romantic, right? And then how modern was different from Victorian. So you see, if you look at the history of English literature and you come down chronologically, you will see that every age tries to uh, create a new set of tenets for art. Why? Why does this happen? This is because uh, one ideology is exhausted and taken to the extreme, and probably um, drained of ideas, and so some passion, vigor, energy is lacking, and so they react and they form a fresh set of ideas. So that is how from uh, neoclassicism we came to romanticism, and from romanticism we came to the Victorian age, right? From the Victorian age we came to the modern age. Hmm? So, um, in Victorian art, you could see realism. So, what is realism? It is a realistic representation, it's as it is in real life. All right. Uh, and this loss of faith moving towards modernism began in the Victorian age itself. You are aware that Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species challenged religious ideas about the creation of the world, right? And Tennyson, in his poems, expresses this anguish about the loss of faith. Tennyson was a believer, he was an ardent Christian. So, this conflict between science and religion uh, came into existence in the Victorian age. Even towards the late Romantic period, Shelley was an atheist. Um, and in France, French Revolution was very much an inspiration for the Romantic writers. So uh, you see that this is movement towards science and away from religion, and gradually towards uh, modernism. So modernism had its it germinated very much in the Victorian age itself, but uh, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of ideas and ideals about how a work of art should be created. Victorian art, whether it was poetry or whether it was painting or whether it was music, was based on the principles of realism. Now, Manet was one of the Victorian painters, and in 1910, there was an exhibition called Manet and the Post-Impressionists. So, the Post-Impressionists were different from Manet. Their paintings were different from the realistic or impressionistic paintings. And there was a critic named Roger Fry who wrote an essay called Vision and Design. So, vision means how you envision something. So, every work of art is born of envisioning. You don't we visualize a painting? A painting is a scene in your mind, a scene with your mind's eye before it actually comes onto the paper or the canvas. So, also, uh, a poem is full of imagery and a lot of things are envisioned. A poem is a word picture. So he wrote this essay titled Vision and Design, in which he laid out certain tenets of what art should be. And this person who was an art critic, a theoretician, he organized this exhibition. And this exhibition showcased the works of Cezanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, Picasso. And uh, here, what happened was they showed this new genre of painting called the post impressionist painting. So, post impressionist painting, as I said, was was a reaction to impressionist and realistic painting. So this is where through art they showed that human character had changed, the world had changed, perceptions had changed. All right. um, you are young, you are just about 17 years old, but even in your lifetime you will see how the perception of the world has changed. A few years ago, you did not have WhatsApp. Uh, you did not have Android phones. You yourselves are seeing Android phones coming. You may not have had an Android phone as a 5-year-old child. You may not have seen an Android phone, but you are seeing how the world has changed. Now, it is so easy to make a video because we have apps. Uh, Earlier, making a video was a very difficult thing and it was done only by certain specialists. So now you know that uh, technology changes the world. So, like this, events and advancements change the world. And with these changes, the art changes, music changes, literature changes. Okay. So in 1910, uh, one of the very influential groups in the world of art was the Bloomsbury Group. And Virginia Woolf, she's one of the major spokespersons of the modernist era. So Virginia Woolf, Duncan Grant, Virginia's sister, Vanessa Bell, they were the members of the Bloomsbury Group, and they appreciated post-impressionist painting They were impressed by post impressionist art. Now, what's the correlation between these paintings and literature? Right? As I said, a, a, a literary piece is a word picture, a painting is a picture on canvas. Would you agree? Yes or no?
Ma'am, can you give the question again, ma'am?
A, a piece of literature is a picture made with words. A
Yes, ma'am.
painting is a picture made with a paintbrush and colors. But both are creation of pictures. Am I right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So there is a correlation between the way paintings are made and the way literature is written. And if the painters and writers of a period will think in the same way because they have experienced life in the same way. They have what they have witnessed of life in that period is the same thing. So there will be more or less same techniques, approaches, ideas, overlap, if not the same, there will definitely be an overlap. And the Bloomsbury group, they were very much influenced by post impressionist painting. Now, listen very carefully what Virginia Woolf said about the Victorian novelists. So, Virginia Woolf said the Victorian novelist style of writing was not applicable to the modernist era. So, when a Victorian writer wrote a novel, you take Charles Dickens, or you take George Eliot, you take Thomas Hardy, uh, any of these writers, they uh, Thomas Hardy would be early modern. You take Charles Dickens, you take W.M. Thackeray, they're all Victorian writers, right? So they create when they created these narratives, all right. So we imagine we can see we get pictures of London, all right, in Charles Dickens' uh, Hard Times. You see industrial London, industrial England, right? You get pictures of the workhouses, right? Of the poverty, of the rising middle class, of the poor, of the deprived and depraved people. So, very graphic descriptions are there, details are given, and even if your home is described, you know the furnishing of the home, the decor, the carpet, the clothes of that the people wear. They give so many. They give the social background, the historical background, all these details, a lot of attention to detail in the Victorian novels, and that is realism. Okay, trying to give the picture as it is, almost like a photograph. So, some of you may like to paint, and some of you would paint um, in your own style. You may make, if you do a painting of me, you might make it like a cartoon. Uh, some of you will try to make it like a photograph. There won't be a difference between a photograph and the painting. It be exact, just the way that person looks in a photograph. You have brought that even in a painting. So that ability to attention to detail and trying to reproduce it, or what we call verisimilitude, is realism. Okay, so Virginia Woolf was saying that this kind of approach to creating a literary work, which the Victorian novelists had, mm, is not the thing that has to be followed in modern life. So she said, the Victorian writers are able by nature to spin sentence after sentence. They seem to have left out nothing that they knew how to say. Our ambition, on the other hand, is to put in nothing that need not be there. So, in other words, Victorian writers included a lot of details, whereas modern writers left out details. They felt that many unnecessary descriptions need not be there because their focus was on the life of the mind, on the thought life of their characters, all right, on the state of mind. What we want to be there is the brain and the view of life. The autumnal woods, the history of the whale fishery, and the decline of the stage coaching, we omit entirely. So, this kind of background about how of trees and the woods, and then the historical background, and all those things they omit. They only keep the brain. What is will be what we want to be there is the brain and the view of life. Did you understand, students? Any doubts?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So I'll just highlighted the difference between the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. So the Impressionists were very much like the Realists. Realists were the painters of the Victorian age, it's 1848 to 1900. So they made lifelike depictions. That's what I said. If they did a painting of you or me, it would be like almost like a photograph, right? Whereas yeah, so the Impressionists emphasized the paint of on the surface of the canvas, flattening the sense of perspective through a lack of tonal modeling and using daring crop perspectives, which were influenced by Japanese prints. Um, Impressionists differed from the realists because they painted in the open air and used pure palette of colors. So they were very much like the realists, but a little different because they brought in modern city life also, and they painted in the open air, and they used a palette of pure colors. So here you have, these are the names of the Impressionists: Basil, Edgar Degas, Claude Monet, Bert Morisot, Camille Pissarro, whatever, all these names, Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Mary Cassatt. But the post Impressionists were just the opposite of these Impressionists. They uh, Cézanne, Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, Georges Seurat rejected Impressionism's concern with the spontaneous and naturalistic rendering of light and color. Instead, they favored an emphasis on more symbolic content. So it was like representational. So if they painted a human being who was uh, working in the field, if they the the image they created conveyed the impression that of a person working in the field, that was sufficient. They didn't go into the details of the dress, the headgear, or only what needed to be conveyed they conveyed. And that is why they often use abstract forms. Similar to the Impressionists, they stress the artificiality of the picture. One second. Let me try to explain this to you in a very simple way. If uh, you want to draw a representation of traffic rules, so you will just draw those stick figures. Do not cross the road when the traffic is on. Wait for the pedestrian cross. Wait at the pedestrian crossing, the zebra crossing, or wear your seat belt. All these, now today you use mobile phones. So you're so used to the emojis, right? And the emojis, the emoticons, they convey anger, happiness, fear, everything. So this is one way of symbolic expression. So though, well, at that point of time, they did not have these kind of emoticons or stick figures, but nevertheless, their idea was not to create verisimilitude, to create a picture which is like a photograph, but rather to create pictures which had which were symbolic, and also to achieve this through abstract forms. So very people like us who are not into art, many of us, we you will take some time to understand what this painting is about, right? So a lot of abstract forms are there, but there's a representation also. So the meaning, the focus is on the meaning rather than verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is exact depiction, or just like a photograph, right? Um, for example, uh, if you have to in an abstract way, you have to depict love. Uh, you may have a heart, you may have two people holding hands, and you may have some other colors in the background, red, orange, blue, whatever. And that is your depiction of love. On the other hand, a very realistic painting would show two people looking at each other with affection and love, and they would bring out the expression on these people's faces. So, one hand, you have in the post impression, among the post impressionists, you have abstract depictions, and among the impressionists and realists, you have depictions which are lifelike, lifelike. So, here you see a picture of gleaners gleaning in the field. So this is very much like a photograph, isn't it? So this is an example of realistic painting. Have you understood what I mean by realism
Yes, ma'am. That picture we couldn't see.
now? Can you see the picture?
No, ma'am.
You're not able to see the slides
Slides you are able to see, ma'am. Now it is only Virginia Woolf. That slide is only there.
now?
No, ma'am.
Oh my. Now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So this painting you see is realistic. Now can you see the painting?
Yes, ma'am.
Now?
Yes, ma'am. We are able to see, ma'am.
So this is Monet's painting. He also was an impressionist. Can you see the brushstrokes so different in the post-impressionist painting? Now this is typically, now this, I told you about the exhibition in 1910. Now all this painting was exhibited in 1910. So it's not exactly like the human form is not reproduced exactly, but you get the idea of Vedas, what, they are resting after having a bath. That idea comes through. But a very perfect image of the human body is not there. Would you agree?
Yes, ma'am.
So this is a typical post-impressionist painting. So from the title, it's about, you can guess it's about human misery, about working class people, about the sad lives of people. So there's on the extreme left, there's a lady who seems to be collecting something. One person sitting there looking dejected, and then you see people and two women in the background. They seem to be working in the field. So this picture is not like a photograph, but it together you get the idea of what it's about. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, this is Van Gogh's painting called Starry Night. It's so beautiful, but it is not a realistic painting. Would you agree?
Ma'am, once again, we are not able to see the picture, ma'am.
Not able to see? No?
No, ma'am. It is
Hmm?
the first picture only.
N- Not able to see. I'll go back. Now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This is another painting which was there in that exhibition. It's called Rain by Vincent Van Gogh. Pablo Picasso's portrait of Clovis Segot. And here you can see the influence of Cubism. All right. So, post-impressionism, Cubism, these are two art forms that belong to the modern period, and it was a kind of theory of art that found application in painting, in architecture, in writing, right? So it was an avant-garde movement. Avant-garde means something new, and it revolutionized the world of painting and sculpture and music and architecture. So, what a typical cubist work of art would be like is it will look like it is something broken up and reassembled. Can you see the very geometrical structures in this painting? Very angular. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, so this is post impressionist and also showing the influence of Cubism. So the representation of the human body, they were not embarrassed about depicting the human body. Ulysses and Calypso by Modernism. So Vincent Van Gogh was also a poet who, he wasn't understood by his fears. And there's a poem about this song, Starry, Starry Night. Let me see if I can play that for you and tell me if you're able to hear it. Otherwise, we can just move on. Can you see?
Yes, ma'am.
Tell me if you can't hear, we won't do the song. Can you hear the song?
No, ma'am.
Now, can you hear?
No, ma'am.
Can you hear? Can you hear?
No, ma'am. Sorry.
You're not able to hear the song?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am.
Now? Now?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Maybe I can share it with you later. It's a song about the sad life of Vincent Van Gogh, where he was not understood by people. And this whole song says that, this great painter who created this starry, starry night had to fight for his own sanity. Sanity, his, state of mind, mental well being. And because he was ahead of his time, he was a thinker who was ahead of his time, he was not understood. Can you see the PPT now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I was talking to you about the post-impressionist paintings of 1910. There was an exhibition in 1910 and again an exhibition in 1912. So why do you think people hold these exhibitions or showcase these works of art? We had stalls and an exhibition in Queen Mary's College recently. Why? Why? They want to promote an idea, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So they wanted, in our college, they wanted to promote the idea of self-help groups. So in the same way, here they wanted to, one second, one second. So you want to come to class? No? Come to class? Okay. Say bye. Because Zoro wanted to come to class. All right. So why do they have these exhibitions? To showcase an idea. So they had the self-help groups and they had the stalls by the self-help groups to encourage others, to encourage people and say there's something called self-help groups which the government is supporting, and to spread this idea, and also skill development, that you need not be unemployed. There are so many training programs. Go and get yourself skilled and be employable. So when they have exhibitions like this, they do it with an idea to promote a way of thinking. So there was another exhibition in 1912 of post-impressionist paintings. Uh, and these writers also were painters, right? So you see Duncan Grant belongs to the Bloomsbury group. Virginia Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell, who's also a writer. These were also painters. And then you had some work by Russian artists also. And this Russian artist, he commented saying that post-impressionist painting was known for its sincere directness, right? Uh, that is one expression we have to absorb, that it was representational, it was symbolic, it was very direct. All right. So let's go back to the statement that Virginia Woolf made about art. Okay. So Virginia Woolf says that the Victorians include a lot of detail, whereas the modernists like her, who are influenced by the post impressionists, they do not have anything that is not necessary, that need not be there. What we want to be there is the brain and the view of life. Okay. Whereas the Victorians, with their realistic style, they include many details. historical background, um, even in the paintings, a lot of details, right? But here it is purely the life of the mind and keeping only what needs to be there, and therefore it is known for its directness. So, as I said, there was a second exhibition. Can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Full screen?
We can see the slide, ma'am. The second exhibition, ma'am.
Yeah. So, 1912, there was a second exhibition. Um, Understanding post impressionist art is the key to understanding the writing style of Virginia Woolf. So there was this feeling that a new start had to be made in politics, society, art, literature. Uh, so they felt that the Victorian approach to Victorian thinking, Victorian art, Victorian sculpture, everything had to be, um, you know, rejected or in a way, and a new set of ideas, new approaches had to be adopted. Uh, this was around 1910, 1912, all this started. Now the war broke out, so 1914. And the war went on till 1918. So it was not as quick and it was not as quickly resolved as expected. So when they started the war, they thought that the issue would be resolved with just firing for a few months, and then they would win the war. But winning was not that easy uh, between the allied forces and their opponents. So it took nearly 4 years. So in these 4 years, there was so if a war goes on for 4 years, instead of 4 months, it goes on for 4 years, then you can imagine the magnitude of the loss, how big the loss was. Loss of life, and then because technology was used, so there was more loss of life than in wars fought on land where people go, they are on horseback and they fight with sword. No, but this was a war with technology, with ammunition, with aeroplanes dropping bombs. So the devastation, destruction, loss was much greater. War fought on land, air, and sea, and using technology, poison gas, machine guns, modern artillery. And because of this, see, when you fight on a battlefield, soldiers kill soldiers. But when weapons of mass destruction are used, when bombs are dropped from the air through warplanes, they will not target only military targets. Even civilians are killed. So there was mass slaughter. So historian Martin Gilbert writes, more than 9 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen were killed in the First World War. A further 5 million are estimated to have perished under occupation, bombardment, hunger, and disease. The mass murder of Armenians in 1915 and the Spanish influenza, like we had our COVID now, the Spanish influenza epidemic that began while the war was still being fought, were two of its destructive byproducts. The flight of Serbs from Serbia at the end of 1915 was another cruel episode in which civilians perished in large numbers. So too was the Allied naval blockade of Germany, as a result of which more than three-quarters of a million German civilians died. this is a timeline of the 20th century. The years we are looking at are 1910 onwards. So let's look at what
Ma'am, we
happens.
can't see the timeline, ma'am.
You can't see the timeline. Now,
Yes, ma'am.
so 1901, Queen Victoria died, and then you had the Boer War fought in South Africa, fought by the colonialists, right? War over territory. Uh, so the British are able to establish their sovereignty in Africa through the Boer War. And this is the year of the publication of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So if you read the novel Heart of Darkness, you will know about it's about this person who is, traveling into the heart of Africa, and he's an ivory merchant. So he's killing, they're killing a lot of elephants and taking the ivory and selling it. And he's the person who's exploring. 1903, Women's Social and Political Union founded. So this is one of the early expressions of women's emancipation, women forming their own political and social groups. Then there's a play performed, Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. In Russia, Bloody Sunday Massacre, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity was a scientific theory, but it also influenced people's way of thinking. It influenced this kind of modern thinking that there are no absolutes, that there is this kind of relativity. Then women get to vote in Finland for the first time. Playwright Henrik Ibsen dies. James Synge, the Irish writer. You have Synge's Riders to the Sea in your uh, syllabus.
Novels. Mm.
Riders to the Sea is a play which is there in your syllabus. So James Synge, the uh, presents his play Playboy of the Western World. First airplane takes off, and then first Congress of Freudian Psychology. Freud and Darwin, as I said, were important thinkers of the Victorian age, and their thoughts influenced um, were a big influence on modernism. 1910, Edward II died. Then you have the Portuguese Republic. Titanic, the ship Titanic sinks. 1914, World War I begins, and James Joyce publishes Dubliners. The Dubliners is a series of short stories. And James Joyce also is one of the very important modernist writers. The first Dada play is performed in France. So Dadaism is also one type of art form. October Revolution. October Revolution of 1917 is in Russia. Marxism, all right? So Russia it moved from monarchy to communism. So they overthrew the monarchy, no kings, queens, right? The rule of the people, it's the rule of the Communist Party. So from Marxism only you get the offshoots of Marxism are socialism. Offshoot of Marxism is socialism. World War I ends in 1918. Then Hitler becomes a leader of his German party. James Joyce Ulysses is published in 1922. The Wasteland also. Ulysses and the Wasteland are representative modernist texts. See, Eliot wrote many texts, but his folk quartets and the Wasteland should be taken as texts which showcase modernist ideas. And he was also he belonged to that school of poets called the Images, right? So especially this the folk quartets is something that showcases images. Yeats, Irish poet Yeats once wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. So this is a triumph because uh, an Irish person being recognized as a writer, as a literary voice, shows that the literary world sympathizes with the Irish cause. All right. So Ireland was always fighting for independence from England. So giving Yeats the Nobel Prize in 1923 was a message that was being conveyed to England that Ireland and Irish rebellion and Irish mm, resistance and Irish desire for self determination to be an independent country and not be under England is being recognized by the world. In Russia, Lenin dies, and then you have a surrealist art group exhibition. So we spoke about Impressionists. Now, surrealism is also a type of art form where uh, reality is, it becomes like a hyper reality. Um, I don't know if you've seen Dali's painting of the melting watches. I'll show you. Can you see this? This is Dali's painting of the melting watches.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you see the screen now?
Yes, ma'am, we can see, ma'am.
Yeah. So this is how he's representing time through the fluidity of time. Maybe that uh, time cannot be actually uh, crystallized, or time cannot actually be put into a capsule or into a frame. So he is represented in this surreal way. So surrealism in art and literature. So 1925, surrealism was being promoted as, in the world of art, and um the colonial government, the empire was becoming very strong. So you saw earlier that in Africa they strengthened their position through the Boer War, through their victory in the Boer War. And here in 1926, they laid the foundations for the Commonwealth of Nations. So all the territories of the empire, they come under the Commonwealth. Then Brecht. Brecht, also a modern writer, And Brecht is known for his absurd drama. So you can look up absurd drama. In absurd drama is based on the theory of existentialism. So with Charles Darwin saying that publishing this origin of of species, and people losing their faith in God and religion, and having more of a scientific outlook on life, and a scientific temper, scientific spirit coming in, or rationalism coming in, gaining ground, or rationalism uh, controlling people's thinking perspectives. We see that from so people are moving out of religion, and modernism is very much a movement which took people away from religion, right? And this movement away from religion began in the Victorian age itself. That's what I'm trying to say. So Brecht's Three Penny Opera was performed in 1928, and as I said, this dramatist used the use a new type of theatrical form called absurd theater. One play that he has is Waiting for Godot. In that, you have two characters, Lucky and Pozzo, are waiting. The whole play is about them waiting. They're waiting, and they keep saying they're waiting for Mr. Godot. So the word Godot could indicate God. And while they are waiting, they do all kinds of comical things, all slapstick things. And uh, this whole play revolving around these two people waiting for someone who doesn't turn up is a representation of this existentialist philosophy, that we do not know where we came from, we do not know where we are going, and we seem to be waiting for something to happen, waiting for God to show up, waiting for some miracle or some sense of direction. So it's about existing. We just exist. Life goes on in circles. This is also one of the ideas of existentialism, that we life goes in circles. In other words, we keep repeating what we are doing. Get up in the morning, have a bath, go to college, study, do a test, come back, and it's repetitive, right? So 1929 was the Great Depression, deep, very bad economic crisis. Who said someone should mute? An economic crisis which affected the whole of England, Europe. In American literature and British literature, you had the Great Depression is spoken of. So it was a period where people lost jobs, and there was a great economic crisis. And the West economic relations, they're economically interdependent. So this crisis affected Europe and America, England, Europe, and America. In 1932, Aldous Huxley published The Brave New World. In this novel, The Brave New World, it's a novel about hatchery in London, all right, where human beings are manufactured. So it's about genetic engineering, about, it's the novel, it is allegorical, this whole context of genetic engineering is to talk about the totalitarian state, how the state or how the government controls people's minds and behavior. So, in this hatchery, uh, human beings are cloned, human beings are made. So, they control even the human reproduction. Alpha people are people with a higher intelligence, then beta, gamma, delta. Delta is the lowest. So, it's like a caste system. And the people with the lower intelligence are given very menial jobs to do, and people of with higher intelligence are regarded as the think tanks of society. This probably was written in reaction to the power that the communist governments were having over people. So, though communism promised equality, the Communist Party was exercising tremendous control over people, making decisions about their lives. So, whatever the government decided for the people, they would do. For instance, the government would decide what a person should study, and accordingly, that person would be given their education. So, the Red Party, the Communist parties, sort of penetrated too much into the personal lives of people, and there was too much control. So now we are slowly, everything is building up towards the Second World War. So you found that Hitler created his party in 19, yeah, he became a leader of his party, right? And Hitler's party comes to power, and then we have the Spanish Civil War. King George V dies, and James Joyce, using Ulysses, is published in Great Britain. Um, then 1939 to 45, World War II. So 1914 to 18, World War I, 4 years. 39 to 45, 6 years, World War II. So again, devastation. So recovery after 1918 itself must have taken a few years. So, so even if, as they were trying to build up, in 1929, they had the big crash, the Great Depression. All right. So, what would these nations have been like? What would have their uh, economic status have been like? What would have been the security of the people? What would have been the rate of employment? What would have been the lifestyle of the people? It's not a very positive picture. Can you understand that? So, 1929 onwards, when the effects of the Great Depression are continuing, yes, and again, we're working towards reconstruction. In 39, war breaks out again. In 47, and at this time, the uh, imperial governments are also being disturbed. In India, the Quit India movement, India became independent in 1947. So the British Empire was losing its control over the colonized territories. And then Ireland. So you came across Yeats' poem, Easter 1916. And Easter 1916 commemorates the lives of people who, uh, the Irish Republican Army, people who fought in the Irish Republican Army against the imperialism of England, and these people sacrificed their lives. So at that in that Easter uprising was crushed by Britain. So they didn't win; they lost. 1923, Yeats was received a Nobel Prize, which shows that the world sympathized with Ireland. The world opinion was in favor of Ireland and was against British domination over Ireland. So finally, in 1949, they became a republic. So something celebratory. So here, 47, India is breaking away from, is becoming an independent country, independent of England, of British rule. 1949, Ireland is becoming independent. And it's very interesting that um, the founders of the Indian National Congress were Irish people, A.O. Hume, right? Annie Besant. And if you look at the Irish flag and Indian flag, same colors. We have similar colors. So Irish people sympathized a lot with the Indian national movement and Indian movement for freedom. In Yeats wrote the prologue, no, wrote the introduction to Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. So there have been a lot of connections between Ireland and India, uh, which are uh, anti-British, the kind of shared sympathy, and shared uh, mutual dislike of British domination. So 1972, Britain joins European Common Market. So they have, so now we have the euro. So the euro is again uh, an expression of um, alliance between the European countries. So they have a common currency. So Britain joined the European Common Market, but now recently there was a Brexit. So Britain wanted to come out of the uh, European uh, alliance. Falklands War. So Falklands was also under the British, and they wanted to come out of the British domination. And I do remember Lord Mountbatten was killed in the Falklands War. Right? And 1998, um, Hong Kong, which was under British domination, was returned to China. And it's very interesting because Hong Kong, they prefer to be under the British than under the Chinese. So that issue is continuing. Now, these are the writers of the 20th century, but the writers whom we would take as modernist writers in this list would be T.S. Eliot downwards. T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Ford Madox Ford, Samuel Beckett, Synge, Walcott, Dylan Thomas. So how's it going, girls? So what did you understand till now? Yes?
Learned about the timeline from World
Mm,
War One to World War Two, man.
mm, mm. And about the major shift in how literature has to be written. In the Victorian age, they gave a lot of details, but in the modernist writing, they focused on the life of the mind.
Yes, ma'am. Artificiality.
Yes. So between World War One and up to the 1920s, um, there was a decline in the intellectual life of London. See, every city uh, has a certain cultural um, life. In the city you have drama, dance, theater, art exhibitions, which you will not have in the rural place. So these in the city, it showcases the changes that are taking place, the new ideas which are coming in into the world of art, new thinking that is prevalent, and um, city life. If the city life is has a lot of vigor and that creative spirit is there, that can be there only during time of peace, isn't it? How can it be there during war? Would you agree with me? Would people be, when there's war, uh, would creativity flourish?
No, ma'am.
No, it would not. So, with the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, the curtain came down on cultural exchanges and programs in opera houses. Consequently, the fabric of London intellectual life appeared to have deteriorated. So, D.H. Lawrence, when he was writing in 1923, he said that the spirit of old London collapsed in the winter of 1915-16. The city in some way perished from being a heart of the world and became a vortex of broken passions, lusts, hopes, fears, and horrors. Uh, and when, um, in the context of war, in the context of some financial emergency and insecurity, people will not be very active in expressing their political views also. Their political views, the space and the energy to express political views is more in time of peace than war. So in political dissent, so even in the parliament, people were not arguing or fighting or trying to counter any ideas because their spirits were quite downcast. Okay, uh, then women, earlier you saw that women's some women's unions were formed in the early 1900s, women's social unions, political unions, women's suffrage. So women's suffrage means women's right to vote. So women fighting for their right to vote, being active in that, some activism around that, that also was silenced. And then Irish Home Rule. So they got it. Ireland became a state in 1949, but we're talking about the period between 1914 and 20. And you saw that Easter Uprising, Easter 1916, that poem, Easter Uprising of 1916 also was crushed. So Irish Home Rule, that bill, no, there was a bill passed whether they could uh, have self-determination, whether they could rule themselves. So this Home Rule bill also was shelved, and it was put on the ice after third reading in May 1914. Then an Irish Free State came into being in 1921. So the six uh, Protestant counties were separate, and apart from those six Protestant counties, the rest of Ireland, which was Catholic, they became an Irish Free State. Um, but Free State didn't mean that they became a republic. Only in 1949 they became a republic. They were still under England. Well, well, some amount of freedom probably. Then post-war Europe and America met at Versailles. You remember the Treaty of Versailles after World War One? It was a peace treaty, but the Treaty of Versailles was obviously a failure because it didn't succeed in keeping the nations without fighting with each other, because World War Two erupted later. October 1917, you have the Bolshevik Revolution and Russia becoming entirely communist. Now, this is a very important thing to note because um, England was a monarchy. England was ruled by a king, queen. England was the first to introduce parliamentary democracy, House of Lords, House of Commons. So that pattern only we have in India, Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha. Uh, dem- the idea of democracy was there, but they still had their monarchy. They had the rule of by the king and the queen, and the royal lineage was there. You had the aristocrats, lord, lady, people having their titles. Um, so, um, in this kind of social structure, you know that it's not a structure which creates equality. That the working class is at the lower end of the social structure, and it is a structure in which those who have for generations uh, enjoyed privilege continue to enjoy privilege, and those who have been working class remain working class and struggle for their livelihoods, and um, they struggle from one generation to the other. So this in Russia, the monarchy was overthrown, and suddenly they declared that everybody was equal. Communist Party brought this kind of forced equality, and this inspired some of the British thinkers like H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw. They visited Russia, and so they brought from Russia a modified version of communist ideology. So it was not that extreme because they couldn't apply it in Britain. Yes, they couldn't have a revolution in Britain. They couldn't overthrow monarchy in Britain, but they brought in socialist thinking. All right. Um, so this Russian communist state became a model state for post-war intellectuals. Did you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so Russia became a model of for socialist thinking. Okay, later on you can look up the difference between socialism and communism, right? So socialism, communism would be the very extreme form, and socialism is a slightly uh, modified form. So um, socialism would give some place for private enterprise, whereas in communism there is no encouragement of private enterprise. Everything comes under the government, right? In Britain, despite social reforms initiated by pre war liberal governments, the condition of the industrial and agricultural poor and of the unemployed often contrasted starkly with that of the rich. So, this social divide between rich and poor, the gulf between rich and poor, remained despite the social reforms. Uh, in Europe, empires like the Empire of Austria Hungary and Turkey, because of the war, right? These these countries, they were on the other side. In World War One, the Allied forces were England, America, France, and their opponents were the European, those who had empires like Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. So they lost, right? They lost the war to the Allied forces. So these empires, they were crushed. Let me show you a map. Can you see the map? Yes? Can you see the map? Can you see the map?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So the bluish gray ones, France, Italy, UK, they are the allied forces, right? And then the brownish ones are the central powers. So even Russia was actually with the allies. Here the brown ones are Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, that is Turkey, right? So did you get an idea who are the allied forces and Axis forces of World War One? Yes? So this will help you understand that statement. There's the Ottoman Empire, the Austria-Hungary Empire. These empires were uh, dismembered. Did you understand that? Yes? So communist Russia became a model state. And then in Britain, despite social reforms, the divide between rich and poor was not bridged. The industrial and agricultural poor suffered. There was unemployment, and there was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. The old continental empires of Austria, Hungary, and Turkey were dismembered. So now these they, these were empires. They had kings, queens, and they had royal people. So the whole governance was through the royalty. But these kings and these these empires, they lost the war. So they were plunged in poverty, destruction. So if you visit Europe, you'll see how many of these palaces uh, and ancient buildings were bombed in the war, and they still, they just remain like that. That reconstruction has not been done. Treaty of Versailles was a failure because World War II took place. Now, why all this background about art and history is to tell you that in literature, that sense of fragmentation. Uh, what do we mean by fragmentation? It's like, you have a mirror and you throw a stone on that mirror. What happens? How would you see your image in that mirror? Yes? You look at yourself in the mirror and then there's a stone thrown on that mirror. How does your image appear? Are you listening? Listening or not listening?
Yes,
Vidyashri?
ma'am. Listening, ma'am.
Yeah. How would your image appear? Fragmented, broken,
Yes, ma'am.
cracked, right? So,
Yes, ma'am.
so just think of the psychology of people, think of the sufferings of people. They have experienced World War One, 1914 to 18, Great Depression, 1929. So hardly they recover from World War One. They have they're plunged in an economic crisis. And 1939, World War II breaks out. So from 1918 onwards itself, this sense of fragmentation, came into, all forms of art. And it was there in people's thinking also. Uh, just for example, now you and I, we have lived through COVID-19. Yes. How do you feel? How did you feel when we had COVID 1920, especially the year 20, just 1 year before this, March 2021, there were so many deaths. March 2020, so many deaths in the neighborhood, among relations. Yes. So how did we all feel? We felt insecure, didn't we?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So we felt insecure because of a pandemic. We didn't know who would go next, what would happen to us, what would happen to our families, what would happen to our relations, right? What would happen to our education? Would we be able to write the exam? So many questions we had. So that insecurity. So you can imagine how people must have felt after 4 years of war. And in the war period, you get rationed food. You don't get, because the government is spending all the money on the war. So the kind of food that you get, whether they had enough electricity, and whether all families had enough food to eat. Now think of what is happening now in Sri Lanka. Yes, days on end, no electricity, water, a big economic crisis in Sri Lanka. How do people feel? They feel insecure. So there was this whatever they went through in because of the World War I brought in this sense of fragmentation, which could be attributed. It had the cultural, psychological effects. So what is happening geographically is also affecting people psychologically. I told you about how the Ottoman Empire, Turkey was crushed, Austria-Hungary crushed. Britain, France won the war, but they lost lives. They, their economy suffered. So, what was happening geographically and historically was affecting them culturally, psychologically, and that's how they uh, started this experimental writing. So, experimental writing is a type of writing in which um, the narrative uh, may not have closure, or if you take the narrative of the Victorian age, they would create that world for you. So you read Pride and Prejudice, you go into that world, you go into that 19th century world, you live in the world of that family, and this whole thing is recreated for you. But with experimental writing, you are always conscious that this is only a novel. Do you get my point? For example, there's one modernist novel called The French Lieutenant's Woman. In that novel has three endings. All right. So you can choose any ending that you want. So the writer says, trying to say, the story can end like this, or like this, or like this. So what happens to you as a reader is, oh, I'm only a reader. This is only a story, and it can end like this, it can end like that, it can end like that. Okay, so that distancing. Did you get my point?
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
Yes. So you're not carried into another world. You cannot lose yourself in another world. You cannot lose yourself in the world of that story, right? You are reminded that this is only a text. So this is one of the features of experimental writing. Okay, one of the obvious things about experimental writing. And this sense of fragmentation could be attributed to the political circumstances, uh, not simply the disasters of the war, but also the social and national revolutions the war had provoked. We must remember that art, post-impressionists, reflected the sense of fragmentation. So the characteristics of 20th century literature, uh, you have the influence Einstein, Darwin, Freud. These were thinkers who profoundly changed Western culture. Modernism, a movement, was a radical break from 19th century Victorianism, led to postmodernism, which emphasized self consciousness and pop art. While 20th century literature is a diverse field covering a variety of genres, there are common characteristics that change literature forever. So, what are these common characteristics? Let's look at them. I've also already mentioned this fragmented structure, fragmented perspective, and then it's about urban life. It's a novel of the city. I told you about Cubism. It is as if something which is broken is assembled together. You saw that painting by Picasso of some Clovis Sagot. It's like it's very geometric, right? So, as I told you earlier, if a stone is thrown on a mirror image, it's like you get the whole image fragmented. So this fragmented perspective or the fragmented image, or you are the painting or art is like an assemblage of broken pieces, right? So this cubism came into writing, into architecture, everything, painting, and then Virginia Woolf also said that she excludes all those descriptions of the parlors and the carpets and the upholstery and the lighting and the dresses and the historical background. She only focuses on the life of the mind, of the consciousness of the character. And her novels um, are a perfect exponent of the stream of consciousness technique. And then multiple perspectives, right? That you see in this experimental writing. As I told you, one novel has three endings. So you are, as a reader, told there are different perspectives. Story can end like this, or like this, or like this. Then coming to the interwar period. Uh, with the influence of the Bolshevik Revolution, with the influence of socialism, with all that happened through the wars, World War One, and its effects. Naturally, uh, people were not, you know, very supportive of the aristocracy and the monarchy and things like that. The the ordinary human citizen, the working class, the middle class. And one thing you must remember about the Victorian age was the rise of the middle class, right? Um, that's why you have the novel Hard Times. You have Mr. Gradgrind. He's got this middle class mentality, and he's like a merchant. He's got this merchant mentality. He's very result oriented. He wants an education that uh, can be productive in terms of industry, okay, output. Uh, so human beings are treated like objects and uh, and like resources. All right, so that kind of a lot of that kind of thinking came. So why I'm invoking that rise of the middle class and the middle class mentality is that in England the educated class were not necessarily the aristocratic people. Middle class people also were educated, and working class people were also uh, people who were reading newspapers. So the newspapers played an important role in the public life of England. Newspapers play an important role in the public life of any nation. So in England, uh, the liberated, the emancipated lower middle class were a strong presence in the readership. They were the people who bought the newspapers, they read the newspapers. Uh, their opinions were counted. Those So the people who ran the newspapers also wrote for that particular readership. Okay? Um, so a text changes according to who is the reader, right? Especially if you're producing a newspaper or a magazine, you will write according to who is buying that, isn't it? Right? So the working class, the lower middle class, their presence was very much felt in the production of the dailies, the newspapers, the magazines. So the Daily Mirror was the first newspaper devoted exclusively to women's interests. The Daily Express, it was founded in 1900, and it developed into a journal of substantial influence and a broad national culture, sense of participation in all elements of national life, newspapers. Um, so newspapers were a conduit, like, conduit is a thing, conduit between the larger public and the world of policy making, the governments, right? So newspapers, they influence thinking. Newspapers also reflected the thinking of people. Are you able to see the screen? Yes, Vidyashree? Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I'll wind up quickly. So radio came in, wireless. So with the wireless, you had the BBC radio, British Broadcasting Corporation, right? And we just spoke about how Android phones have changed education, isn't it? We had online classes. So just imagine how radio must have influenced uh, the world of entertainment. So people would earlier they would go to a music hall to listen to music, but with the radio, the music came into their own homes. So how wonderful was that, right? So popular entertainment shifted from the public domain into the domestics. People were working in their kitchens and listening to music. People were working in their workshops and listening to music. So it was so dance music was not just only in the ballroom but also in the home parlor. Then cinema. Uh, with cinema halls, people were able to, look at palaces, great settings, right? So with the modern cinema, people could visualize and think of that this we know about modern cinemas. A lot of plays of Shakespeare were made into film. A lot of novels were made into film. So initially, a lot of writings were made into film. So when people visualized uh, a novel when they read, they could now they didn't have to visualize, they could see it on the screen. And another interesting thing is that the directors, movie directors, they departed from the text, they improvised, they took some liberties. So that was also another thing about cinema. Okay, poetry, you have the images. This is very important, students, so you should know who the images were. uh, Now, imagism is different from symbolism. All right. Yeah. The images were a group of American and English poets whose poetic program was formulated about 1912 by Ezra Pound. Um, and there were fellow poets Hilda Doolittle, Richard Aldington, and F.S. Flint. Now, in the images creation, the visual image made a total poetic statement. So when you learned literary forms, you were taught about imagery, symbolism. So a repeated image becomes a symbol, right? Um, like if you take a novel like Iris Murdoch's The Sea, green is a symbol of jealousy. So you have the green-eyed monster, the sea turns green, someone's eyes are green. In Tess of the Devils, red is symbolic of violence. So it describes the red strawberries, the red of Tess's dress. You see the red tractor on the farm, uh, and then the red blood when Tess murders Alec. So red is a recurrent color, and um, it's a whole build up towards the violence that is uh, going to come later in the narrative. So that is an example of symbolism. But the imagism is a different line of thought. So the images, all right, wrote succinct verse in which an exact visual image made a total poetic statement. All right. So that one uh, image makes a complete statement. Let me give you an example. Anecdote of a Jar. It's an American poem by Wallace Stevens. You can read that. Maybe I can share that poem on screen. And then you have poems by Ezra Pound. I think London Metro is one poem by Ezra Pound. See this poem. It's just 2 lines. Can you read the poem, Vidyashri?
The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow.
So just 2 lines, that poem is, right? So this is an example of imagism. Well, it's not that, all images wrote short poems, but one image makes a total statement. Did you get that idea? Yes?
No, ma'am.
Hmm? I'll show the poem again. An exact visual image made a total poetic statement. Can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, the image here is petals on a wet black bough. Petals on a wet black bough. So black bough is a black branch. On that black branch is wet, and that wet black branch has petals on it. Okay, can you visualize? Okay, now the poem is about what he sees in a station of the metro. the faces in the crowd, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. So the faces in the crowd are like petals on a wet black bough. So one image, petals on a wet black bough, encapsulates everything. Did you get the idea now? Yes or no? So you can try to spend time looking at the difference between symbolism and imagism. Okay? I cannot spend more time describing this. So now the novelists of the modernist and post-war period. D.H. Lawrence, he wrote Sons and Lovers, Lady Chatterley's Lover. He was influenced by Freud. And uh, Virginia Woolf, her novels have very clearly the stream of consciousness technique. To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, all these novels. James Joyce, Ulysses is about a day in the life of a person named Stephen Dedalus. Evelyn Waugh was one of the first novelists of the modernist period. Graham Greene wrote a novel called The Power and the Glory. It's about uh, a war situation where it's very dehumanizing. I remember in this novel by Graham Greene, The Power and the Glory, it's about a priest who is fleeing a war-torn country and he's hungry. There's one scene where the priest is hungry. The priest is competing with a dog for a bone, right? So these kind of very surreal, um, grotesque images are there. Then Aldous Huxley, I told you about that novel, The Brave New World, about human engineering and how they're trying to create human beings who with different levels of intelligence. The alpha people, very high intelligence, they'll be the rulers of the world. The delta people who will do the mechanical jobs, who will do whatever they are instructed to do. So four alpha, beta, gamma, delta, four levels of intelligence, the delta being the lowest one. So this is about how governments try to control the minds of people. Then George Orwell wrote political allegories. George Orwell's 1984 is also about how governments try to control the minds of people. George Orwell's Animal Farm is about the it's a no it's a, that novel is also an allegory, and in that novel the farm animals they rebel against the owner of the farm and then they run the farm on their own. They have their own government. So they're supposed to bring in equality, but they don't. So famous line in that novel is some all animals are equal, but some are more equal. So when we've studied degrees of comparison in grammar, can there be more equal? It can be equal, but can something be more equal? You have equal halves. One cake, if it's cut into four pieces, all four pieces are equal. But these pigs who want to dominate other animals in that narrative, they say that some are more equal. Then in William Golding's novel, The Lord of the Flies, you find that there is a group of boys who land on an island and they're schoolboys. So somehow they're away from their families, they're away from their elders, and then they are very cruel to each other because there they have to survive. Okay. So in that novel is again about human nature. Muriel Sparks, The Driver's Seat is also a very is a novel with this modernist orientation. So you have literature of World War II. Um, the outbreak of the war in 1939, right? As I said earlier, with the war, you can't have people who are creative. They don't think creatively. And also, the very practical problem was that paper became expensive. So people couldn't write, they couldn't produce magazines and books. The best fiction of this period was Evelyn Waugh's Put Out More Flags. In poetry, T.S. Eliot's Folk Quartets, that was published in 1943, is a masterpiece of the war. In the 1950s, you had a group of writers who were called the angry young men. Why were they called angry young men? Because they were angry with the establishment. They were angry with the way society was structured. They were angry with the way the government was ruling the state. And they were anti establishment. So the anti establishment means they were against the order of the day. They were against the rulers of the day. And these were young middle class people. So you remember that British society was a very hierarchical society with the royalty, aristocracy, and a working class coming at the lower end. So these young men were actually from the working class background and they disliked this kind of very hierarchical structure in British society. And that is why they were called the angry young men. John Osborne's play, Look Back in Anger, is a representative text of that period. Alan Sillitoe was a writer of this period, one of the angry young men, and he was the son of a tannery worker. He wrote a novel, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. Tells the story of someone from his background, working class background, who is addicted to drink and sex. And Saturday Night provides the only oppression relief from his working class life. And then in the 60s, you had the novels of the empire. You can take a look at it later. So, women writers of British modernism, Virginia Woolf, right? Richardson, Catherine Mansfield. Yeah. So, the important prose writings, people who wrote about the way literature should be. So, Rogers Fry's Vision and Design, then Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians. He writes about 4 Victorians, right? Cardinal Manning, Florence Nightingale, Thomas Arnold, General Gordon. And he was actually attacking Victorian ideals in that. So he says all the false ideals of heroism, which were there in the Victorian age, these are ideals we cannot have in the modern age. So then you have Virginia Woolf's modern fiction. It's a very wonderful text in which she says, life is not a series of big lamps, but a luminous halo. All right. So if you look at a street, you have lamps, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. But life does not have that kind of linear thing where you can count 1, 2, 3 and proceed that way. It's a kind of bright light, and you cannot penetrate into that light and understand what is in it. It is a luminous halo. This is what she said about life. And so life is very complex. And she said that literature should reflect this complexity of life. Literature cannot try to show life in a neat package as the Victorian novelists showed. So thank you for listening to me and those who have stayed through this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.